QSO Today episode 238, Andre Hansen K6AH. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, who are excited to announce the new IC 9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Hans Summers, G0UPL's kit company, and creators of many fine radio kits including the popular QCX transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Find links to both on this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guthforz, your host. Over 200 QSO Today episodes ago have passed since My QSO with Jim Kinter, K5KTF, about HSMM networking, using repurposed Linksys routers to create a ham radio broadband community network allowing hams to interconnect their shacks together with a parallel wide area network to the Internet. This idea has since evolved into what is known as AREDN today through the work of my guest today, Andre Hansen K6AH, and his team of volunteer AREDN developers. Our ham radio spectrum above 2 meters is very valuable not only to us as ham radio operators, but to commercial interests such as cellular telephone and cable operators. Deployment of AREDN in many communities throughout the world is allowing hams to occupy our valuable radio spectrum 2 gigahertz and above. A little explanation about Andre's picture in the show notes page. He is holding 2 MikroTik devices that are popular now in the AREDN network. The small box is the MikroTik LDF5, a 5 GHz transceiver that installs in discarded satellite TV antenna dishes instead of the LNA. The U.S. cost of this device is about $40. The larger device is a MikroTik Basebox 5, also a 5 GHz link for much bigger antennas and for longer link paths. Andre says that the smaller LDF5 in a DirecTV dish will work 30 miles line of sight. And now, without further introduction, Andre Hansen K6AH. K6AH, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Andre?
I am, Eric. Good morning.
Andre, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
You know, every time I'm asked to tell this story, I have to chuckle. My sister, who was 4+ years older than me, had been asked out by this young man, and my parents weren't terribly excited about her going out with this guy, and they learned that he was a ham radio operator, and so she signed up for a ham radio night school class, and my parents said the only way you're going is if you take your brother with you. And I was in fourth grade at the time, and so I got hooked on ham radio pretty early on. I then, during the course of all that, was taken up to Mount Soledad, a prominent mountaintop on the coast here in North San Diego County. And from there, this young man and I talked to the South Pole, which totally blew me away. And that's how I got hooked.
So San Diego County then, or San Diego is your hometown?
Yeah, right. I live in the Carlsbad area of San Diego.
And you've lived there all your life?
No, I've moved around quite a bit. I've had stints in Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, Australia for a while.
Where did you go to school?
San Diego State.
And where did you go to high school?
In Claremont High School.
I went to Helix High School.
Yeah, I understand you're a local.
Yeah, El Cajon Amateur Radio Club.
I know them well. I've done a presentation there. The WB6 Big Green Spider, BGS.
That's right. I haven't been there since 1973, so it's been a long time for me. What happened? I mean, you're about 11 years old, I would guess. Did you get your amateur radio license, your novice, or something like that in those years?
I have to admit I failed the novice test, and it set me back, actually. I was taken aback. I was convinced that I could do this, and you know, as a little kid, you don't know any better. And anyway, I failed it, and then about 5 years later, I think I'm in ninth grade. I think I was ninth grade. I took the test again, and was able to pass it this time around. So then shortly thereafter, within, 4 or 5 months, I tried to pass the general and had to settle for the technician license because I didn't pass the 13 word a minute code requirement. But then 2 or 3 months after that, I went back and passed the code, and then took and passed my advanced at the same time. So, and that was 1970, 69, 70.
What was your first call sign?
That was WN6AQZ. That became WA6AQZ when I got my upgrade. And then I didn't pass my extra class until I think it was 2007 when I went hunting for a 1x2 call and found K6AH, which I've held since then. I did have an interim call sign, KE6UQ. The FCC was really never good to me in issuing call signs. And then when I was in Australia, I operated as VK3DSH.
Did you have any mentors or Elmers that helped you along?
I did. I had 2 primary Elmers. One was David Corsiglia, WA6TWF. He was the young man that was wanting to date my sister. He went on to build and continues to own the Southern California Super System, which is a network of UHF repeaters throughout Southern California. And the other was Don Stancifer, W6LRU. And before he became a silent key, he got a vanity call, N6RU. He was the man who did the instructing in this ham radio night school class. And I went to that class for years, even after I had gotten my advanced ticket, because he was always so full of knowledge and eager to help. And it was a classroom full of new and existing hams who were either trying to get into the hobby or upgrade their license. And it was a great time to socialize and kind of get knitted into the ham radio community. Those are the 2 that I would lift up as the primary ones for me.
Well, I haven't heard David's name for over 40 years, but of course he was well known even 40 years ago.
I spent a fair bit of time at the club station there and had fun doing so. I think they didn't really have current equipment at the time, so I was a bit taken back by that. But I had plenty to play with at the house. So,
do you remember your first rig?
I do. It was the transmitter was an LMAC AF67. I think they called it the Transciter, if I remember correctly. And it was my novice radio. It had 2 crystal slots, and it actually had a VFO, which I wasn't able to use as a novice, of course. And then I had a Hallicrafters S120 receiver, which was really built for the shortwave listening market and didn't have a lot of selectivity nor sensitivity for that matter. So, I worked, locals. I built a power supply for the transmitter and got it up and operating, and that was my first pair of radios. And then my parents, for Christmas one year, bought me an SB102 Heathkit kit, and I put it together over the following week or so. And I can remember the only time my parents ever let me call in sick when I wasn't really deathly ill. They let me call in sick for the first 3 days of the new year in order to finish the kit, and that was a great radio. It still is a great radio.
Well, it sounds like your parents were terrific as well.
Yeah, they were real supportive.
Yeah, I'll say.
Yeah.
And what kind of antenna did they let you put on top of their house?
It was an 18 AVT, if I recall correctly, and we lived in an apartment complex, and I convinced the property management firm that there would be some value to the entire community for me having this antenna on the roof, and they went along with it. This was long before.
And what was the value that you convinced them? What could you do for them?
Well, I had started becoming involved when I got my driver's license with ARES, and I gave them the MCOM. I used the MCOM approach to convince them. They were nice people. They, if unless somebody was likely to get hurt or it was a real community nuisance, they would go along with it. It wasn't a tough sell.
Did ham radio play a part then in the choices that you made for your education and career?
It did. I went through the electrical engineering program at San Diego State, and from there I got a job as a sales engineer for an professional audio product manufacturer, and then from there to a junior engineering position with a micro-based computer manufacturer, quite a ways before the PC became popular. So it was real innovative, and the engineering group at that company didn't have a lot of experience with the current thinking in microprocessor architecture, and I had just come out of a program that focused on that. And I also worked for the Naval Electronics Lab here in San Diego out on Point Loma as a junior engineer, and that was part of a contract they had with the San Diego State University Foundation, which, among other things, found part-time jobs for engineering students so that they could get practical hands-on concurrent with their education. It's a great program. Loved it.
Were you an electronic engineer throughout your career? And are you still working?
I moved to the IT side fairly early on, and I had a career as a manager in IT and product development for a computer services company that transacted credit transactions. Then went into project management, started my own project management consultancy, and then decided that I had been working too hard and it was time to spend more time with my family, and I went back to becoming a project manager out of the management side of the business altogether. And that was really my last job, 10 years at Abbott Laboratories, and I retired about 2 years ago.
Wow, good for you. We talked before I started rolling the tape that you're more active now as a mobile amateur. Well, what's your current rig?
It's an ICOM IC7000 and a high-Q 5/80 antenna. And then I've got a Kenwood TMD 700 also in the car,
which is a dual band VHF
UHF. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so most of your operation is mobile. And you said to me that you've worked a number of countries on HF mobile. Is that right? How many countries have you worked?
Yeah, I think it's over 150. The last time I counted, I think I was approaching that number. I log those the interesting ones, and but I'm not a DX chaser, and I'm certainly not somebody that feels a need to get rewarded for the number of countries. I don't submit them for any awards and that sort of thing. But I do enjoy when I'm driving down the road, having the HF radio on and tuning around, finding interesting conversations to keep me company while I'm driving.
Do you have a favorite band when you're out there driving, or do you operate multi-band?
Yeah, well, multi-band, but propagation being what it is, it's really 75 and 40 meters. Probably 40, I would say, is the most common band you'll find me on.
On single sideband?
Yep, sure.
In episode 18 of the QSO Today podcast, over 200 episodes ago, I interviewed Jim Kinter, K5KTF, about the HSMM/mesh networking based in Austin, Texas. What is AREDN, and how is it different from HSMM mesh?
Yeah, so the expression or the acronym HSMM stands for high-speed multimedia. It was an acronym that the ARRL coined, and Jim Kinter and that group in Austin, Texas, started being known as HSMM, but the league quickly asked them to change that because that was a term that was intended to be more generic than any particular implementation of HSMM. And HSMM didn't define the modulation techniques. It didn't define, the operational parameters of the technology. And in fact, it never really built operational systems around what they coined to be HSMM. Jim Kinter was with Broadband Hamnet, or BBHN, and going back several years when they were limited to the Linksys WRT54G, that's that little blue and dark gray Wi-Fi router that everybody has in their garage. They retired some time ago. And so that had limited range. It had, I think, 19 milliwatts was its power limit. Wasn't real practical for anything but sort of neighborhood experimentation or extending internet out to the shack and so forth. So I and a partner of mine approached Broadband Hamnet and asked if we, the two of us, could do software development for them to port that software over to more viable, more tower viable devices. And they agreed to that. So for a period of, a year and a half or so, my partner and I, developed that software and introduced compatibility with some commercially viable devices that were at the time were being used by the wireless ISP community, delivering internet access to homes in rural America. And those became popular very quickly. Unfortunately, there came a need due to differences of priority and opinion on where we should head. The project was forked into AREDN, which continued on developing software around the core BBHN open source core. And that has evolved over the course of the last 4 or 5 years to be what AREDN is today. So we have common roots.
And now this message from ICOM America. I'm so excited to be able to tell you about the new ICOM IC9700 SDR transceiver. ICOM had in mind the weak signal operator when it applied its DSP and direct sampling technology to the IC9700's receiver design, allowing the operator to dig out the faintest signals from moon bounce and meteor scatter contacts. The ICOM IC9700 is a tri-band VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz transceiver. Operating modes include AM single sideband, FM, CW, RTTY, and all of the digital modes. You can even use the IC9700 to talk on the local D-Star repeater, making it an ideal rig for exploring the amateur bands 2 meters and above. For the satellite operator, the IC9700 has dual independent receivers that allow full duplex crossband operation with normal and reverse tracking, and 99 memory slots for your favorite satellites. The IC9700 is beautifully appointed with an almost identical footprint to the IC7300. It will make a beautiful sidekick to your current HF rig in your shack. With its 4.3-inch color touchscreen, you can easily control the rig and find the band activity using the waterfall display. To learn more about the IC9700 or any of the other fine ICOM products, go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur or click on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit your local ICOM dealer to purchase your IC9700, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. Do you know if the BBHN is still operational? Are they still doing their things? And if they are they doing it on the same kind of platforms that AREDN is doing, or have they? When you say it's forked, which direction has it gone in?
Yeah, it stayed pretty stagnant. They haven't, that I'm aware of, they haven't had a release since my partner and I went our own way. And, it was the software at the time we forked the project didn't support a very long list of devices. It's probably 20% of the device count that we have today on the AREDN open source project.
So what are the innovations and enhancements that AREDN made to the original BBHN?
BBHN was based on OpenWRT, which is a open source project that is for wireless routers. And OpenWRT's objective is to make their software run in as many routers as possible. And there are a number of router manufacturers that have their own proprietary operating systems, and of course they would never be in play because they would never have facilities to allow someone like the AREDN project to load its software on their devices. But most of them, in order to save development cost, take OpenWRT as a basis for their operating system, and then they customize it, add to it to offer the unique feature set that they feel would sell more of their product. So AREDN is also based on that, and up until about a year ago, we had a fairly closed development environment. We called ourselves open source, and certainly anybody that wanted to put the effort into it could also develop on that core. But it wasn't until about a year ago when we put all our code on GitHub, which is a very common or popular open source development website, and now we've accumulated, 6 or 8 new volunteer hams to help us code. So development is going at a much faster rate now than it ever has, and we have where originally we had ported the BBHN software only over to a limited number of Ubiquity devices. Ubiquity is serves the wireless ISP community. We now have ported that software over to 2 others, TP-Link and MikroTik.
Which is router board, right?
Yeah, exactly, router board. Yep. Yeah, I don't know. The last count, I think we probably have 30 or 35 devices that we're running on. And that's one of our objectives is to not make the hardware choice part of the software choice. So if you choose to run AREDN software, you have the greatest availability of product offerings. And we've added lots of support for network management. We've increased the speed of it to 802.11n, which is 144 megabits per second. These AREDN networks can run much faster than most of your ISPs that are delivering those services to your home. So it ends up being a very viable technology for building these networks, and they are in the process of being built all over the country and to a lesser extent the entire world.
Okay, so I saw a number of slide presentations that you made that are posted online. Thank you very much. They're great, and I'll put links to those in the show notes page. Is there a specific AREDN topology that you recommend for building out these networks? So for example, it appears to me that you've pretty much covered San Diego County, maybe most of Southern California. What's the topology that you use in order to build out those networks?
So it's called mesh. And indeed, the devices do form a mesh. When you bring up a number of these nodes, as we call them, they all recognize each other and start talking to each other, and they form sort of a cluster of links. And indeed, the mesh technology that operates in that fashion has lots of advantages. It's incredibly redundant. You can have anything interrupt a link and not cause an outage in the network and so forth. But what we have found over the years is that when you leave hams to do that, what develops is a bunch of what develops is a bunch of mesh island. These islands might be a community-wide or a town-wide and so forth, but nothing is there to bridge, let's say, a mesh island in North San Diego County with somebody in East San Diego County, somebody in South Bay. All of them are operating as fully fleshed AREDN mesh networks, but they don't interoperate. So what I decided to do is to use San Diego as a bit of a guinea pig, and I developed what I have come to call a backbone throughout the county. And this backbone is intended to be a high spot in the topology and geography that mesh islands can point to high gain antenna to become part of the bigger amateur radio mesh. That same approach has been used to interconnect the counties of Southern California together. Some years ago, some of us that were really into this technology got together and sort of established some ground rules on how these networks were to be built, and we divvied up on a county by county basis the whole of Southern California. I took San Diego County and the southern part of Riverside County and so forth. Similar people are responsible for implementing in Orange and Los Angeles, Ventura, Santa Barbara, San Bernardino, and so forth. And now that all of those interconnects have been put in place, we have an RF-based internet covers the Mexican border up through Santa Barbara and then east to Coachella Valley. That would be Palm Springs and Indio. This thing has taken on a life of its own, and I'm excited to say that now there are people that are building very useful applications for MCOM to run on the network. It was one thing to build the network, but then you sat around and you just looked at the network. There wasn't anything useful, meaningful to do with the network, but that's changing rapidly now.
I'm thinking a lot about how we might deploy a mesh network here. Do you recommend starting as these community clusters and then putting the backbone in? Because it seems to me that actually might be the way to actually create some excitement at first, is to get individuals to create mesh nodes, on 2 gigahertz, for example, and start connecting their community together, and then start thinking about putting in the interconnections between communities. If you're starting from scratch now, how would you approach it?
Yeah, I think I probably would still start it as small mesh islands. What will happen with small mesh islands is they'll take advantage of a feature that we've added to the software called tunneling. And what tunneling does is it allows you to connect a mesh island through an encrypted internet pipe to another mesh island, and all the routing traffic is passed through that tunnel so that it appears to be one larger network. That's all good and fine, so long as it's used for the right purpose, and that is to provide that connectivity while you're still building the RF-based interconnectivity between the meshes. The problem with that strategy is that the internet is likely not going to be there during an emergency, and if you're building this for MCOM, you had better not become complacent or satisfied with the operation of this larger mesh based on these tunnels. And I to be honest, I'm a little disappointed that so many of those tunnels are being used today, because I think in the long haul, it ends up detracting from the real purpose, which is to build a ham-based RF network that will operate when all else fails.
Well, I think I see the same thing in DMR systems, All-Star. I'm on All-Star. All of these internet-linked radio systems are really cool, and it's really easy to get complacent and say, oh, it just works, but you're not, you're still using that trillion worth of infrastructure that you're dependent on in order to interconnect. Whereas AREDN sounds to me that this is the best way to bring all of those systems together on a independent infrastructure that's not dependent on the internet for to be working.
Yep. Many clubs are starting to do that now.
Hey, this is Eric with this quick break. I'm a big podcast listener with over 20 podcasts loaded automatically into my smartphone every week. My favorite ham radio podcast is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George KJ6VU and Jeremy KF7IJZ. Every other week, George and Jeremy take a deep dive into their Workbench projects that become boards and plans on their website. If you're a ham radio builder or want to be a home brewer, then be sure to click on the link to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast in this week's show notes page. How does AREDN cross into the internet? Do you use, even for EmComm, do you use any internet resources on AREDN, and how do you limit those or control, what's actually coming from the internet as a resource?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, actually. So each node has the ability to become an internet gateway for the rest of the mesh. And it's as simple as clicking an option in the setup menu or setup page. But we, as a general rule, discourage the use of an internet gateway like that because, what you get from the internet is typically encrypted. And, while during a disaster, it may be, quite a reasonable thing to do, but there are many hams that feel that that's risking their ham radio license by passing encrypted traffic. That is a discussion in and of itself that I have spent hours and hours with passionate hams on. But that isn't to say that you won't encounter an emergency operations center that wants access to Web EOC, which is the popular cloud-based disaster management software available today. Most all EOCs have access to that software, and it's all internet-based, and it's all encrypted. We certainly recognize that during times of disaster, you have to provide the services that the customer you're serving needs, and that's all good and fine. But one thing we don't want an AREDN mesh network to be is an alternative internet access facility for hams that maybe don't want to pay for an ISP themselves.
I read someplace in my research that perhaps you guys are using WinLink as a way, if you needed to send email, for example, out of the AREDN network. Are these the kinds of gateways you're looking at that are like quote-unquote ham radio gateways that get you to get messaging in and out?
Yeah, exactly. But there are other ways of doing it as well, like, for instance, a proxy server. You see this with organizations. Red Cross might be one of them. The AUXCOM groups might be another. They see a need for that, so they set up within their data centers a proxy server that talks to the AREDN network on one side and the internet on the other. And so, you can run unencrypted connectivity between the client at the disaster shelter site and the headquarters site, and then encrypted from there out to the cloud-based service that you're looking to gain access to. The same thing applies with the Red Cross Safe and Well app. That's a cloud-based service that provides the impacted communities the ability to let others know that they're safe and well. And so there'll be a bank of laptops at the shelter, and they'll be able to connect through the AREDN network to a proxy server, to the cloud-based service, where they can identify themselves as being safe.
Now, have you developed multiple access points in the AREDN network so that, for example, if you needed to get to the Red Cross Safe and Well application or server, but a portion of the network is actually off the regular internet because of some disaster, like the recent fires, say, for example, in Malibu. So maybe any of the AREDN nodes that happen to be over there that might have a proxy server to the internet in that location essentially there's a back door that could be down in, say, the Coachella Valley, for example. Are you doing those kinds of things and that kind of coordination?
Yeah. So the AREDN project is really a software development project, and my implementation in San Diego and South Riverside County is not part of the project per se. It's just another passion I have about implementing this technology. I would say within the network that I operate, I would selectively ask hams to click the box, that says, yes, I'll extend internet access. And then those devices that can't connect through their proxy can then use that as an alternate routing means. And I think most hams would be willing to do that if it were a bona fide disaster. Some hams would be interested in doing that anytime anybody asked for it, but at a minimum, during times of a real disaster, hams step up and recognize that they're able to do whatever they have at their disposal to support the health and well-being of the people that are being served.
In an MCOM environment, are you then putting mesh nodes in places other than ham radio QTHs?
Yeah. In fact, the ham radio QTH doesn't serve the MCOM community all that well unless you're one of those lucky hams that live in, on the top of a mountain. So the topology, which I began to describe as, based on these backbone nodes, then will have sort of a mid-tier supporting infrastructure, which I call mid-mile nodes or relay nodes, and they sit on lower hilltops and support local communities, and then during times of actual disaster, hams that support disaster organizations will then take an AREDN Go kit out to a site and set it up so that it can connect up to a mid-mile/relay node, or maybe even to the backbone node directly, but then at the same time serve the local cluster of users right there at the shelter with Wi-Fi access, so they can connect their cell phones and laptops and so forth and connect through to their headquarters operation.
And how do you manage non-hams connecting via Wi-Fi to the AREDN network and using it for this kind of stuff? Or is there some special ruling or some way that you're handling this?
Well, first, in order to gain access, they get to our website. The website asks them to register. We look up their call sign when they have asked for a registration and confirm that they're a ham. But in the end, what keeps these devices from being called Part 15 devices versus Part 97 devices really amounts to the frequencies you choose to operate them on, and whether you put your call sign in the node name ID. And if you put it in the node name ID, then it's the node is going to identify you by call sign as the control operator every 10 minutes, just like we do on VHF and UHF and HF for that matter. So we make sure that identification requirement is maintained. But if they don't have a call sign and they don't do that, then they stick out pretty obviously in the mesh. And of course, hams are pretty good at self-policing, and that's how they're taken care of. Could somebody, let's say, a group of preppers set up their own mesh based on our software and operate it unbeknownst to us? Yeah, they probably could. But then they can operate my Kenwood TMD 700 just as easily, and it's not a new problem. It's the same problem we have been managing for years when it comes to unauthorized use of ham radios.
It's my understanding that the 2 gigahertz amateur band and the 5 gigahertz amateur band kind of overlaps the ISM band a little bit. Does AREDN know the difference in terms of where the band edges are? And if you had, for example, an unlicensed person using in an MCOM situation, for example, an unlicensed person using the network, could the system actually limit them to that portion of the ISM band, so that, in other words, the AREDN network could be configured in such a way that it looks like a public Wi-Fi network?
Yeah, there's some things about the nodes themselves that distinguish themselves from regular Wi-Fi, but you could operate this within the Part 15 spectrum, the ISM spectrum, on either of those two bands. Although the 5 gigahertz band actually, hams are a superset of what's available for Wi-Fi there, and hams are a subset on the 2 gigahertz band. In other words, channels 1 through 6 are in the ham band, but 7 through 14 are not, or 7 through 11, I suppose, in the U.S. Yeah, so nothing prevents them from doing that. Like any use of a ham radio, the responsibility for knowing the laws of what frequencies you're allowed to operate on, what power levels you're allowed to operate within, and so forth, are the responsibility of the licensee, of course.
Now, when I think of mesh networking, at least here in Israel, I'm thinking all the time of building a node that is self-contained, solar-powered, in case the commercial power goes down. Have you guys built a bill of materials and a design for a small solar-powered node that could go on a ham radio operator's house?
Yeah, we, to my knowledge, don't publish one on our website. There are hams that have identified links in the forum, the support forum, that other hams can go explore and follow. There are certainly plenty of them that have been built. My backbone nodes, for example, are all have backup power and so forth. Yeah, I would say no, we really don't have one we would point you to, although I could certainly spend a few minutes doing the research for you and find a number of them.
Would that be the ideal? I mean, when hams decide to become an AREDN, I'm using the word node, maybe that's the wrong term, but when they decide to put up an AREDN mesh network node, what do they normally do? It's house powered, and they buy the Ubiquiti equipment. They use a power over Ethernet switch or something to power it. What do you see as the most prevalent way of deploying this at the customer level?
My experience tells me that most hams operate them off AC mains when the devices or the clusters are at their house, and when they are putting together Go kits to support AMCOM work, then they are looking to their customer to define for them what the service standard is they're looking for. And in most cases, I find it 72 hours, that within the first 72 hours, there are no alternatives to this method of communications. And within 72 hours, they've restored basic services. That obviously isn't always going to be the case, but you have to put some sort of limit on the design requirement. And in order to get to 72 hours, you really don't need solar power. You just buy a big car battery and put it on trickle charge. And when the power dies, that node is going to run for 100 plus hours or whatever. By the time, and maybe this is the term you were looking for just a minute ago, by the time you put up a cluster of AREDN nodes, there may be one or two links to the backbone or the mid-mile nodes, or maybe a couple of sector antennas that are distributing the AREDN network downward to the lower lying communities. And you've got as you said, a PoE switch to power. So you've got about 5 devices, each of which is running about 300 milliamps of current demand. So amp and a half, 72 hours, you put a 120 amp hour battery, gets you to 72 hours pretty easily.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, Let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hansen's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Okay, so what kind of services then are you running over the AREDN network?
Yeah, so that's not really a question for me so much as it is for the hams that are supporting the organizations that are using the network. We see things like a chat application for text-based messaging. We see email of several different varieties, including WinLink, which is by far the most popular of them. We see security camera video streams from mountaintop-mounted pan tilt zoom cameras, some of which, by the way, have been used very effectively for the firefighting effort, Ventura, Santa Barbara, and those counties that were so devastated by the fires recently. And then we're seeing actually a new type of application being built and run. And that is a disaster resource management systems where you can dispatch somebody to a disaster site. You can message them. You can keep track of how long they've worked, when they need to take a break. You can manage the ham radio support of a disaster with the app, and it's all graphical and map based. So you can see at a glance where your resources are and move them if necessary. All based on an AREDN mesh based map tile server, which as you move around geographically in the map, the tile server will keep you with the correct zoom level and the correct street map of where you're interested in. There's one in particular that I am pretty impressed with called MCOM map, which I think if you were to Google, you would find a demo site and an example of what I'm describing.
Okay, so I guess one of the things we have to say to maybe the uninitiated listeners, and I'm one of the uninitiated hosts here, when it comes to mesh networking and AREDN, that this is a communications network very similar to a local area network or a wide area network, meaning that these applications don't just exist on the AREDN network. They're actually server applications that are sitting in the homes or offices of the ham radio operators that are connected to the network, right? So if I wanted to operate this MCOM map application, there's actually an MCOM map server somewhere on the network.
Exactly right. And most of the time they're run on Raspberry Pis that are powered off the PoE switch. So when you're building one of these clusters, you would definitely house your services there at the cluster so that you're not dependent on some other site that may or may not be hardened and may or may not have emergency power.
So, for example, if the El Cajon Amateur Radio Club members wanted to have a voice over IP system so that they could call each other on VoIP phones, for example, by putting in their call signs, then essentially they could just put an asterisk application and asterisk telephone server on a Raspberry Pi in one of their members' houses, and essentially they've created their own communication system within their club. But that doesn't prevent from any other cluster or groups of hams anywhere in the AREDN network from creating similar kinds of applications.
No, that's right. And indeed, that's very popular. Asterisk is probably the single most predominant server-based PBX. And, we're actually trunking the PBXs together now, and we're holding nets on these VoIP phones. There's a weekly discussion that goes on here in Southern California where you dial into a conference line on one of these PBXs and you sit there and chat with, 10, 15, 20 hams that, are all going through the same sort of AREDN experience. So,
yeah, full duplex, right? Just like your telephone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Right. Yeah.
Do you see that your footprint could be large enough that a Wi-Fi, quote unquote, like a Wi-Fi handy-talkie, push-to-talk device, I see a few of them in the marketplace now. I even think that ICOM has Wi-Fi push-to-talk walkie-talkies. Do you see that it's possible to combine this kind of technology with a network like the AREDN network so that one could carry a wideband handy-talkie that works between these nodes?
Yeah, although I would say your cell phone is probably just as well suited, if not more so, for that. Your cell phone will talk over Wi-Fi. It'll be, there are a multitude of applications that support that. And at a disaster site, and I'll take you back to the MCOM example, you can provide Wi-Fi access to people at the shelter, and they connect their phones to it and use a VoIP app to call others throughout the mesh network. That's being used a lot. But I don't see any reason why you couldn't, as a VHF, UHF manufacturer, develop that support and provide push to talk for. I just don't know. I just don't know that hams would necessarily use it for that unless they feel that they're making AREDN more of the traditional ham radio experience. I can't tell you how many times I've done presentations and a hand in the back will be raised and they'll say, well, where's the push to talk button? And I don't have one to show them.
Right, because it's a backbone. It's not the end user device. Do you have repeaters, like repeaters using, for example, All-Star or IRLP or something like that are using the AREDN network or their backbone?
Yep. Yeah, DMR. Yep. Absolutely.
And that's the preferred way to go, ultimately.
I would imagine. I'm not particularly passionate about any of those technologies, but nor do I know a lot about them. But, I do see the discussions going on in supporting them on our forum, on our website, ardenmesh.org. Yeah, so I see more and more of that going on. It seems like every week there's a new group that's coming on board to do just that.
What's the exciting future for AREDN Mesh in terms of new developments?
Yeah, so we do have a couple of features on our roadmap that I'm pretty excited about. One, today the mesh is a little exposed to non-hams and poor performers that are detracting from the operation of the network. And as a ham, you have the choice, just as you would on a repeater, to disinvite individuals who are causing problems on the network. That's a feature I'm looking forward to. And I'm also looking forward to a quality of service function. And we're not quite sure how we need to approach this, but the objective is to, during times of real emergency, that those nodes that are supporting real emergency traffic get some level of priority higher than the typical ham that may be streaming video from his shack or whatever. And today those all run at the same priority level, and it would be great to have that feature available during a real disaster. And it's beyond that, support for more products and support for maybe different routing protocols that are more efficient and maybe faster in terms of updating routing tables and that sort of thing. But that's kind of an esoteric discussion. But it interests people like myself because we spend a lot of time in discussing those kinds of things.
Well, I think that anybody that doesn't want to go deep into AREDN has probably stopped listening. I do have a question. video, for example, IP video takes a lot of bandwidth. Does AREDN, being a mesh network, does it load distribute that bandwidth in order to essentially keep from wiping out an AREDN node?
No, it does not. What does happen, though, is the encoding, the video encoders, some are much better at slowing the speed down on demand and speeding up when the bandwidth is available, so that those dynamics are often managed well, often not so much. And the user sees it pretty quickly in the actual jittering of the chopping of the video image and so forth. So he or she learns pretty quickly to manually force the speed of those isochronous data streams, himself, because he wants a good sharp picture that doesn't look so much like the traditional amateur radio television stations. In fact, we're seeing a lot of slow scanners that are actually moving over to, they're going digital via AREDN, and I don't know if they're actually dropping some of their old analog slow scan technology or if they're just augmenting it, but there's a fair number of them that are moving over.
If you were going to estimate, how many hams in Southern California are on AREDN now?
Well, if you look at how many hams, I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you we have right at 400 active AREDN nodes on the Southern California network.
Between Santa Barbara and San Diego?
Yep.
So that's about 200 coastal miles, right, would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
200 coastal miles, and then inland, another 100 miles. Yeah.
What kind of impact amateur radio's had on your family life?
No, it's funny. So I will. I have to admit that it makes me chuckle because when I was married, when I got married for the first time, I didn't think to have a prenup that sort of defined the demands I was going to put on the relationship from a ham radio perspective. But my first wife did not want to be the home in the neighborhood that had that big ugly antenna. And then, as we've discussed, I lost my wife to an illness here a couple of years ago, and have since remarried. And again, I failed to make ham radio and antennas a condition of our relationship progressing. So, I guess I'm just not a good study when it comes to that sort of thing.
I remember it was a surprise to my wife on our honeymoon when I turned on the 2-meter radio and started calling CQ in the middle of New Mexico, and she turned to me and she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm seeing if there's anybody out there to talk to." She says, "Well, I'm sitting next to you."
Yeah, I get it.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I guess it's the proliferation of digital modes. I think that has a sort of a newfound interest, or spawned a newfound interest for a lot of hams, and I think it's bringing a lot of new hams to the hobby. I know that AREDN, being one of those, seems to be a good connect point between the amateur radio hobby as we know it and the interest level of younger teens who are sort of looking for something to pursue their computer interests, and ham radio and these technologies, I think, tend to draw them. Yeah, I am blown away by all of the young people and the students, college students, who are exploring and adopting the AREDN technology. And I can only read what goes on with some of these HF digital modes and replacing RTTY on the HF bands. It's exciting. I just wish I had the time to actually explore some of that myself.
Well, I actually hadn't thought of AREDN being a way to, or mesh networking to be a way of attracting young hams, but in fact, it's a parallel universe, isn't it? And a licensed parallel universe, so that may in fact be a way to attract younger hams into the hobby.
I'm putting on presentations routinely to existing hams, ham clubs, and even international MCOM symposiums and so forth. But at the same time, some of our developers are going to the Unix and Linux conferences and setting up booths to attract an interest from that side as well. So I agree with you.
Wow, that could create an amazing open source community that supports AREDN and ham radio in the future.
Yep.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
This is something brand new to offer, and it'll be foreign to both of those groups. I would say that if there are people that are interested in learning something new, boy, does the hobby have a lot to offer to them today.
I would say that I woke up after 25 years and found the whole thing had changed for the good.
Yep.
Andre, thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I know that we've kind of scratched the surface of AREDN. If the listeners want to reach you somehow and find out more about what you're doing and what AREDN is, what's the best way to do that?
Probably on the ardenmesh.org website. You'll find succinct instructions on how to build these devices and these networks, the technology on how this all works is explained. You'll find people that are at all stages of learning, understanding, and implementing this stuff there on the forum. It's a very active forum. We have probably 100 posts a week or so. The developers, both those that are part of the core team and also those that are participating in the open source development side of it, are always responding very quickly to questions. And so I expect the inquiring ham would find lots of support there and a friendly environment to participate in.
Well, that sounds great. I've got also some links to some YouTube presentations that you've made, and I'll put in the show notes page. So there's a lot of resources on your show notes page as well. Andre, thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was really a pleasure. And with that, I would wish you 73.
Right, 73, Eric. K6AH, clear.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Andre. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K6AH in the search box at the top right corner of the homepage. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.